Hi, all. I wanted to say a few words about something that's been passing through my head lately, and it's regarding alchemy. Alchemy. We probably, most of us remember when we were studying in grade school, there was an occasional reference to the idea that alchemy was a precursor to modern day chemistry. And then they would go into a brief explanation of what the alchemists were trying to do, uh, which was, generally the idea was suggested that they were trying to convert lead into gold. And so it was presented in a way that, you kind of had the impression, wasn't this a quaint, archaic, uh, foolish, perhaps, simple uh, attempt to do some kind of fantastical thing. It was kind of a way of asserting the superiority of modern day chemistry and science in relation to these foolish people back then who thought they could turn lead into gold. Well, it may be that there was a little more to alchemy than that. And I think perhaps the person who studied this the most and kind of brought this out the most was Carl Jung. So he wrote a lot of works about alchemy and kind of tried to explain it in a more complete way. And what fascinates me about it is this idea that Christianity became a kind of central mythical principle, a central kind of organizing principle in Western consciousness. For you could argue the last 2,000 years. Um, of course, there are some other religions in the West, and there's atheism, and there's so many different branches of Christianity. But generally speaking, this Christian theme, this Judeo-Christian, and also I would say Islamic, these principles that are found deeply embedded in the you could say Christian mythology have been primary factors in the evolution of Western society for the past 2,000 years. So are there are there limitations to that? So if you look at religion and societal evolution, and you kind of if you take a really broad look at the evolution of society, and you look at these old traditions of, say, more pagan religions, um, religions that we don't know a lot about in terms of when man was first evolving from hominids into man, and you had the first beginnings of what might be called religious or spiritual or practices that did not relate to gathering food or subsistence, but rather express some kind of artistic or spiritual inclinations. And then you move through various more complex religious systems that evolve out of that, and you get into gods and goddesses and ritual, dogma of tremendous variety, right? And then you reach a point up at the Roman Empire where there's this gigantic shift um, away from what might be characterized as a polytheistic understanding to a monotheistic understanding. So there's a broad acceptance of this uh, one God principle, and and there's also this underlying principle of God in human flesh. And there were actually several cults and religions prior to Christ. You could say 1,000 years prior to Christ, you started to get this bubbling up of this transition from a polytheistic orientation to a monotheistic and God in human form transition. And then Jesus comes along, and that gets taken up by society in a very large way, right? As it ends up becoming the the main principle through which Western civilization kind of organizes itself. And operates on. So anyway, that's all fine, and you could say that's part of the evolutionary progression of societal consciousness in terms of religious expression. But is that the end? Was it complete? And I would say no, from what I've learned from Jung. And what are some of the things that are missing from that Christian dynamic? And of course, kind of the most glaring one, I think, is that it's patriarchal. It's excessively patriarchal. So, like, I was thinking, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Amen. What's missing from that? Father, Son, Holy Spirit. What's missing from that? Well, mother, daughter, mother, daughter. And there's another principle that Jung addresses in terms of this kind of excessively pure quality that's associated with Christ and Jesus and Christianity, and that it creates this kind of polar duality where you have Christ as good and then the devil as evil, and with that excessive emphasis on Christ from that perspective, it doesn't accept phenomena in the world that occur that are really neither good nor evil. They're simply just the expression of phenomena. You could say, if you want to use the term divinity or universal energy or whatever term you want to use, it expresses itself in this wide variety of things, which we then apply human labels to, like good or bad, good or evil. When a tree falls on a car, is that evil? It's just nature happening, right? And you could say that principle really applies to all phenomena, all activity. So there's these two major issues. The first, I think, being this absence of the feminine in the Christian dynamic, and I would say also Judeo-Christian and Islamic. It's a primarily patriarchal thing, and therefore it's missing the feminine. And then secondly, that there's this emphasis on purity and a lack of recognition that all phenomena lie within what could be called, divine expression or universal expression. So if you say that only pure events, pure phenomena, pure people are true and part of God, what about all the rest of this stuff that interacts with what's true and good? It's all, if you start with the premise that God is universal, omnipresent, then all phenomena, regardless of how you mentally judge them, all of them are expressions within a whole system, you could say. So to get back to the initial purpose of this video is, so what about this alchemy? And perhaps alchemy was trying to address some of these missing principles in Christianity. And one of the reasons, of course, that the alchemists had to kind of keep this also secret was that they could be executed, because once Christianity became the standard, we all know what happened to people who question the status quo. You could be executed, burned at the stake, right? So it became a means of governmental force to require people to see God through the prism of Christian dogma, right? To the point where you would execute people. So the alchemists did this a lot in secret, and that's part of the reason that some of their works are so obscure and so hard to get a handle on. But considering this notion that they were trying to take the next step in, you could say, religious spiritual evolution of societal consciousness, and or you could say the next step in spiritual religious consciousness was expressing itself or manifesting as this investigation into alchemy. And so how did that manifest? Well, the alchemists, they were trying to find the spirit in the physical. They were trying to find this essence. We could say, we think of it as turning lead into gold. Well, what does gold represent? It's getting to that pure, most perfect, most complete essence that exists in all things. And in a way, a beautiful comparison that Jung makes is that the alchemists were in a way trying to do externally what Eastern spiritual practitioners are trying to do internally. So, in the East, the tradition is to use meditation as a means of reaching some kind of internal transfiguration or internal transcendental shift, so that consciousness recognizes itself, you might say, or becomes conscious. Well, you could say alchemists were trying to do the same thing, but they had an externally oriented perception. So they're trying to create in the laboratory, if you will, with material objects. They're trying to find this same thing. And if you look at things from a microcosm macrocosm perspective, what's the difference? If you reach total consciousness internally, then of course it manifests in your external experience. If you can find this consciousness externally, then it would also be manifesting internally at the same time. Tantra yoga kind of verges on this a little bit. Tantra yoga proposes that all phenomena are a gateway into transcendental consciousness. All phenomena, all external phenomena. So, the most popular and perhaps well-known approach from the East is that you go inside, you go internally, you kind of separate yourself from the world. You have the image of the yogi retreating to the caves, separating himself or herself from the society and internalizing, and then through this internal work reach the transcendental state. But in Tantra Yoga, the notion is that this same path can be made by completely investing your attention and awareness in, you could say, a meditative way into all external phenomena and internal phenomena. It's kind of a complete. It's the opposite. It's apparently the opposite, but they're both doing the same thing, right? And so you could say the alchemists were trying to do this. They were trying to find this essence, this transcendental, divine principle in matter. And so I think it's a much more powerful resource for us. It shows many things to us rather than just being some crazy, ignorant historical folks who foolishly were trying to convert lead into gold. It's actually providing a kind of a progressive step after Christian consciousness. You could say, prior to Christianity, 1,000 years prior or whatever, man is experiencing God as an external phenomena in an imagined deity, right? Powers that be outside. You come to Christianity, Judeo-Christian Islamic, where God is coming into human form, right? And then we have a monotheistic relationship with that. And then progressing beyond that, you get not divinity in an external human, but divinity in all of us. That's what the next step is. So it's all human beings are divine. The divinity is within and without and in everything, can be accessed through a variety of paths. So I just wanted to kind of share these ideas with you of alchemy being a much more important and significant step in terms of religious spiritual consciousness than just some side crazy thing that was a precursor to modern day scientific chemistry. And one of the other things I wanted to include here, which is found in a lot of alchemical texts, was this feminine, this missing feminine that's missing in Christianity and other patriarchal systems. In alchemy, you had it. So they had what's called a quaternio. There was a balanced expression of masculine and feminine, and that related very much to finding this complete divine or pure or essence, to finding that golden end it was related to a balance between masculine and feminine forces. And you could say this is analogous a little bit to the yin and the yang symbol from the East, right? You have these polar dynamics which create the whole. You have to have these opposing forces to have the whole system. And of course, we just look around you, look at our whole life experience. It's this balance between masculine and feminine forces, this balance between opposites. And in the alchemical texts, a key fundamental principle within the procedures, techniques, practices they were doing was that there had to be this balance between these masculine and feminine forces. And there are often representations of a king and a queen. You could have a king and a queen, and then you have a man and a woman. King and a queen, man and a woman. It's a 4-point balance between masculine and feminine. And then there's also this balance of light and darkness. So these balanced, symmetrical principles, I think, are evident in the world anyway. And so they must be interlaced, or they must be present in a system that's going to speak to us in a complete way. And that's kind of why I think you see a collapse, a lack of interest in, a turning away from, or a growing out of, Judeo-Christian and Islamic principles. They're kind of on their last leg, I think, and there's going to be a transition. That doesn't mean that those systems will go away or be totally superseded, but they will most likely be transformed into something different. A little corollary on this is, there's an interesting phenomenon within the Catholic Church where you have this cult of Mary worship, right? What's this about, this cult of worship of Mary? Well, of course, Mary is a feminine principle, and it's almost as if when Catholicism tried to assert itself over various cultures, there's this need for, or this reality of the feminine in the world. It has to be expressed. It needs an outlet. It needs some kind of expression, and you could say that manifested in this cult of Mary within the Catholic Church. In the Protestant Church, you don't get that. They wiped that. It's got to be totally patriarchal in the Protestant Church. But unfortunately, as Jung said, this holding up of Mary is a little bit lacking also, like the Christ principle, in that it's this pure, overly purified interpretation of mother and divinity, and it lacks the dark side, if you will, or the opposing side, or the other facets of the feminine, which would make up a whole feminine. So it's just interesting to look at how these things play out and how they relate to each other, and perhaps how it relates to consciousness now in modern man, woman, and how that's evolving and where that's going to go next. So would love to hear your thoughts on this. Christianity, alchemy, and then what's next? What's happening now? Perhaps Eastern tradition, how that relates. Anyway, thanks very much. Take care.